Okay, since we're no longer able to meet in person, I thought I would do like a little YouTube video. I have to time it, and hopefully it will be below 10 minutes. I wanted to do this because of events that we're witnessing right now in the news, and I thought I could apply some sociology and just show you how you can make use of sociology. So um, there are just some things that we're observing right now. If we're being consumed by media news, obviously the coronavirus, there's all sorts of consequences because of this virus. It's affecting our economy. It's also revealing other social inequalities. And it's also revealing consequences for our political system, right? And also how we may be affected by this, how we go out or how we isolate ourselves, which we're told to do, right? For good reasons, we're told to isolate ourselves. So this is where I bring in the sociologist who gets credit for the Risk Society thesis. His name was Ulrich Beck. He's a German sociologist, and he actually died about 5 years ago. Um, but this theory is still very much alive, and while I was observing some events, I was instantly struck out by how this theory is really relevant. So what does Ulrich Beck mean by the risk society? He argues that there is basically a transition occurring in our society that's moving away from production and distribution of goods and and more towards risk definitions, right? So we're more confronted with things of how we define risk, right? And there it already starts. How do we define risks? And in different cultures, there are different views of risks, right? But for the most part, is kind of an obsession with trying to minimize bads, right? So there's like a precautionary idea that's put into the idea of risk. So another thing, because Beck is a sociologist, he wants to emphasize that risks, are not just simply something in technology, but are also social. Risks are very much socially defined differently in different cultures, right? So one of the ways he tries to amplify this is how do we define, natural risks that were really produced by nature, such things like a volcano, right, or perhaps an earthquake. And people often rationalize that this was caused because of gods or spirits. So Beck is trying to move away from this view that everything is a natural risk, and he coins this concept of manufactured risks, right? So the word man is placed into the definition of manufactured risks. I have also sometimes heard the phrase used of organized irresponsibilities or consequences because of modernization. So when we think of modern risks, think of the ways humans have impacted their environment, everything from pollution to genetically modified foods to also more and more deadly viruses, for instance, like the coronavirus. These are examples of manufactured risks. So here's just a short quote from the book Risk Society, where he tries to again redefine what he means by the Risk Society thesis. It says, in advanced modernity, the social production of wealth is systematically accompanied by the social production of risks. Accordingly, the problems and conflicts relating to distribution in a society of scarcity overlap with the problems and conflicts that arise from the production, definition, and distribution of techno-scientifically produced risks. Right. Another thing to think about to what extent does risk haunt the poor? And here, Beck was famous when he said, made a statement, we can see wealth accumulating at the top of societies, and there's still a lot more risk in store for people that are often located at the bottom of society. There are a variety of examples of this, particularly in the United States, where there's no universal health care. The poor are often at greater risk for not being able to afford cancer screening, right, or diabetic medicines. But in another way, risk kind of sometimes transcends class boundaries too, right? So here's another way to think about risks. Some things that often we don't recognize. There's some cherry picking or filtering of what we read in the newspapers, but think of risks associated with toxic chemicals, pollution in our water supply, genetically modified foods, risky medicines, things like this, right? Another concept that I think is important that Beck mentions is this boomerang effect. What he meant by that, basically, as currently illustrated with the coronavirus, is the boomerang effect that even the rich can't purchase themselves safety, right? Basically, everybody gets affected, regardless of wealth, black or white, or living in north or south, east or west. So in the risk society, this is becoming more and more real. Now, the next few slides, since I'm lacking time, I wanted to use some examples that illustrate this risk society idea, going back as far as the Chernobyl disaster that happened in 1986. I believe HBO has made a TV series out of this, but that's an example of mismanagement, miscalculation, and a disaster which had serious consequences, radiation exposures for millions of Europeans. Another example is the famous Exxon Valdez oil spill that happened, which was devastating for the wildlife, killed many birds, and as again consequence of a giant oil tanker spilling. Others sometimes point to the use of certain chemicals in warfare, industrial agents, for instance, which also exposed a lot of military soldiers and then died consequentially, or later got cancer. Other examples is a discussion often about smog and in cities, right? So these are just some examples of risks, and then I include this example. I think this is more recent. Ended up making a movie out of this. An oil rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico. And the more recent example, obviously, is the current example, the coronavirus pandemic, which emerged in China and now since has spread to numerous other countries, right? So it's really influencing the entire world, and we can see the numbers here of the cases. And as I make this video, the cases are still going up. So basically, those are some examples that I wanted to give. I am going to really jump to this slide as a general question, maybe also for discussion. Is what I think of as a good discussion to have. Are we really living in a risk society, as Ulrich Beck explained? What is really meant by manufactured risks? Who's all involved? And also, since many of us are part of universities and colleges, to what extent are we often depend on external funding, which is often tied to our research? Or does that, in a way, reveal that even academic institutions are frequently not immune from political decisions, right? And then also, as a general critique, do you like this approach theory? Do you think it's too pessimistic? Do you see any similarities with this theory and other theories that we discuss in sociology? So I basically run over time, but I hope you enjoyed the podcast.